Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Made for More podcast. I am Ali Nitschke, your host for the show, and today I'm very excited to share with you a guest. So I am interviewing a wonderful guest who is talking all things feminine power and stepping into that as a leader, some of the unlearning that needs to happen as well. It is a fascinating conversation, so much so we are talking about what part two will look like as well. But I did want to introduce her to you. Her name is Josephine Palermo. She'll correct me on the pronunciation in the main interview there, but Josephine brings a deep understanding of gender psychology and organizational dynamics to her philosophy of feminine power. Her latest book, Rising to Feminine Power, The Lasso of Truth, documents the journey women go through to achieve true feminine power in their work and life, and explains why many women struggle with power. She's also the host of the popular podcast called Gears Action Growth, shifting business culture one conversation at a time. Josephine knows how to build an engaging conversation and share her expertise, passion, and personality in a way that keeps audiences magnetized, and I was certainly magnetized throughout our conversation today. One of her key focuses is around how do women overcome the barriers they face and use a positive feminine lens to create and build collective power. If you are listening to this and you're thinking, yes, I want to know all about it, if you are not a woman or someone who identifies as a woman and thinking, I don't need to know anything about this, I will challenge you there and say, listen in, because there is so many lessons to be learned around our biases, our conditioning. And Josephine also talks a little bit around, some of the blueprint for, the template for modern leadership. So if you are a leader already, an aspiring leader, a seasoned leader, listen in to this one, because I think leadership is shifting, and Josephine shares her expertise on that today. Let's dive on in. As always, please like this, leave us a review if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to share it with your friends. Welcome to the Made for More podcast. I'll be sharing my experiences along with some actionable advice to take your leadership to the next level. Introducing your host. It's me, Ali Nitschke. I'm a leadership and courageous conversations expert, a Nutella lover, a mother of 4 young boys, a wife, and a dance floor junkie. I'm here to give you the motivation you need to level up, lead yourself, lead your team, and your business. Let's go. Welcome to today's episode of the Made for More podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have joining me Josephine Palermo. How are you?
I'm good, Ali. It's beautiful day. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I've just realised I pronounced your name incorrectly. Can you correct me on that?
I know you've got to roll the R. Palermo.
Oh, Palermo. Yes, I'm going to have to practice that a little bit later. It is wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much.
Oh, look, it's great to be here. And I know we're going to talk about some things that we're both really passionate about. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation too.
Me also. So why don't we actually just kick right into it? Can you share a little bit with the listeners and those who are watching, where did you come from and where are you going?
I love those questions. So I'm a daughter of a migrant Italian family, and a lot of my ideas about what I didn't want to do come from there in some way. So I grew up with role models that didn't express my idea of what it was to be a woman, what it was to achieve as a woman. And so really my whole life purpose was to look for other role models, but also to do things differently, because in my family, traditional Italian family, Southern Italian family, the women were very oppressed or suppressed by the men. They were in service to the men in that family, and that was just tradition, and it was what you did. And I knew that education was my ticket out, so I was really focused on school. I got a PhD in education. I thought, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to do it differently. And so when I did my PhD, I actually studied gendered psychology, and I looked at what kind of impact women had in the workplace, and particularly women in management, and what was that feeling of marginality that they had, and how did it impact them, particularly being different, rather than being part of the major group, which we know, there are more males in management. So 20 years on from there, I've had a whole career. I've been an academic. I've worked in corporate. I've had very senior roles in corporate Australia, leading large teams, leading leadership development, as well as cultural and strategic change. And I thought, it's time to write a book that people will actually want to read, because nobody reads your PhD. All the publications that come after that, I mean, they're very academic, and so it's not accessible to everyone. So I really wanted to write a book that was about what can you do at a very practical level to strengthen our ideas about femininity and what it means for women in their work lives, in their family, in their life in general. When we bring our whole selves to everything, what does being feminine really mean? And can we do it differently? Can we think about it differently?
Oh, I love this. I'm so glad that we're having the opportunity to talk about this today, because I I hear this a lot, and I think it's becoming more and more mainstream. I know you mentioned you've been doing this for the last 20 years. I feel like sometimes experts, which you are in this field, you're going, yeah, but I've been talking about this for decades. Everyone's only just kind of catching on. So very, very timely. And you really touched on it just in your intro there around what does this actually mean for me? So do you think for our listeners, you could sort of share the idea around femininity and
Yeah.
feminine power, and then the yin and the yang for that, the masculine and the masculine
Yes.
power, and sort of how you've seen that play out over the last couple of decades, specifically in that corporate space, in that leadership space?
Yeah.
What are the roles, and what are you seeing changing at the moment?
Yeah. And unfortunately, I have to go to a definition first, but then I'll tell a story. So
Excellent.
so femininity and masculinity are gendered identities. So they're not related to our biological sex. They can be, and often females born with female sex organs are acculturated, or we socialize girls to be feminine, and we socialize boys to be masculine. And in fact, we treat babies differently depending on whether we think they're boys or girls. There's been some really, really interesting research that shows that we will pick up a baby that we think is a girl in a different way to the way we rough handle a baby we think is a boy, regardless of whether they're actually a boy or a girl. So these socialization practices, the way in which we think of the gender divide, happen very early in life. It's the early experiences that form our perception of what men and women are. But when we think about psychological gender, both men and women have masculinity and femininity. We can express both of those things, but women will express femininity more so than men will, and men will express masculinity more so than females will. So there's that. So when we separate out gender from sex, there's a bit more freedom there. So then we can start to question, well, why are women in roles that are more passive? Why are women in roles where the majority of their work roles, they tend to be clustered in areas in an organisation that has the less paying jobs? Why are women there? Why are men in positions of power more so than women? Why do we only have 18% of women in the Australian C-suite? What is going on? When we actually look at the characteristics of femininity versus masculinity, we don't see that femininity is irrelevant to leadership and work. In fact, we see femininity as being very relevant to particularly
Mm.
the adaptive problems that we face today in leadership. Because when we think about it, leaders are facing into a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of adaptation and innovation that they need to drive. And really feminine characteristics of relationship building, collaboration, working in a
Yeah.
more collective sense, thinking of power in a more collective sense, empathy, understanding each other, and really leaning into feelings. We need all of those things for the future capabilities
Mm.
that we know are important for leadership, and we need all of those characteristics, those particular traits for those problems that we're going to solve. Because the problems we're solving are really complex problems. You're not going to solve them with the same information that you used, back when we were dealing with just complicated problems. So femininity, particularly when we think about it that way, is almost like the template for modern leadership. And yet we still see a lot of females, a lot of women not in those roles, and we still see a power differential. And that's because of stereotyping, biases. It's the way in which we've all of our structures in society and at work have been developed to really be biased against femininity. And so I want to make a case for femininity. I want to say, we need to think about which of those structures in our workplaces, in our family life, in our home lives are structured and biased against femininity, when that's actually really what we need.
Oh my gosh, so good. Oh, let me just calibrate that with my own understanding of femininity. So I'm not sure if you know this, Josephine, but I've got 4 sons who are
I
all quite
didn't know
young.
you
So
had 4 sons,
yes,
actually.
yes. So I'm deeply invested in
Mm,
making sure that they aren't necessarily only put into that stereotype of boys being
yeah.
boys. And all of my sons proudly wore tutus right up until, well, they probably still do on the weekends. We're painting nails. And it's interesting how you say
Yeah.
how society teaches little boys and little girls differently, because I've got my third son, he's 6 at the moment, but he's got this beautiful golden long hair, blonde hair, very, very long,
Yes.
halfway down his back. And when we're out at the shops with all of my children, so all 4 sons, people treat him very differently
Yeah.
and speak to him differently. And then they find out that he's a boy, or he identifies as a boy. And it is fascinating to watch people just completely change their demeanor, their tone, the way that they even approach him. It's a very good lesson in how we are conditioned to think.
Yes. Yes.
So
Absolutely.
what I'm hearing is it's one of those things that, when we talk about nature versus nurture, by the time people are entering into the workforce, what do you think are sort of some of the key things that leaders need to be thinking about when we're talking about this template for modern leadership, which 100% we need more caring, we need a lot more problem solving as we
Yeah.
get into more of those complexities and complications. What do you think are some of the keys that leaders need to be able to identify and perhaps even unlearn as
Yes.
part of the next era, the next iteration, evolvement or evolving leadership journey?
Mm. There's a few. There's a few. I think that firstly, we need leaders to be recruiting for these characteristics, and a lot of our recruitment processes don't do that. We still have a lot of recruitment processes that recruit on the things you know. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
the technical expertise
Yeah.
versus some of these capabilities, which are more intangible in a way, but more relational, more about the way in which you are in the world rather than the way rather than what you know. So I think leaders need to steer away from this competency compulsion that we
Yeah.
have, where we feel like if we just get the right person with the expertise, the technical expertise, that'll be right. And in particular, what we have to acknowledge is that women have had less of an opportunity because of biases, because of our socialization, and also just a lack of opportunity to practice leadership. So there's no point recruiting, particularly to leadership positions. There's no point recruiting based on past experience only on that, when you know that for some women who have had career breaks, etc., who have perhaps not put themselves up for a position in the past because of lots of self-doubt around imposter syndrome, etc., which is not
Yeah.
about what they think of themselves, it's what others think of women and gender stereotypes that they then internalize. So
Mm-hmm.
that what we have to do is actually think about what are we recruiting for? And for example, I'll give you an example. When I was at Telstra, I was a general manager in charge of strategic change for Telstra operations, and we had apprentices that were coming in to the technical roles at Telstra, the kind of network engineering roles, and we weren't getting enough female applicants. So the first thing we did was change the photo in the ad, because the ad had, the recruitment ad had a photo of a boy with
Yep.
tools. So we changed that to, so that meant we got more applications from girls and who were eligible. However, they weren't getting the positions. And so when we looked into that, what we found was that the interview process was based on what was their experience handling technical tools. So if you want to
Right.
get girls into apprenticeships, you don't ask them about experience where they've had more limited opportunity because of what they've been handed to them, the opportunities that they've been handed to in high school, in their family life. They're going to have less opportunity to perhaps handle tools. It doesn't mean they're not interested in it. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be great at it, but they've had less opportunity. So what we did was we changed the recruitment process to a group assessment process where we could view those potential candidates in a group activity and see how they related to each other. Are they likely to be able to speak to customers, etc.? And what we found was that more girls were being recruited because they kind of really blitzed the group assessment, whereas they weren't doing as well in the individual interview. So that again, we just changed a little thing to create a higher level of access for those jobs. And so firstly, for leaders, definitely looking at all of those systems that perhaps bias women even getting their foot in the door. And then secondly, you need to create an environment and a culture that helps people flourish, helps all people flourish. There are a lot of non-conforming men who would love to express femininity more so than they are allowed to, or feel like they're allowed to do, in cultures that perhaps are more focused on competition and domination and more sort of assertiveness. I'm not saying that competition is irrelevant or unnecessary. There's really good uses for competition in corporate Australia, in global corporates as a cultural characteristic. But if you're totally focused on expressions of power which are about competition at the detriment of expressions of power which are about, let's work together on something, let's have a collective impact,
Yeah.
then you're not going to firstly attract the kind of people that are more likely to feel comfortable in that environment, but you're also not going to be setting up the conditions for people to succeed who have those characteristics, who want to work more collectively, who have empathy, who scan their environment and really are great around relationship building, and perhaps they don't have that natural inclination to compete at all costs. I don't think we know again, many organizations fail when they have that kind of culture because individuals just don't thrive, and they don't come together to solve problems. And so they might have had that special sauce when they were dealing, again, back in the day when we were dealing with very complicated problems. Engineering problems are complicated problems. The world of AI and technology is a complex problem. Those things don't align anymore.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So what do you think when it comes to that's obviously when leaders or new leaders are joining an organization as part of the recruitment process. What about some of the unlearning that needs to happen at those more senior levels of leadership? I know I work with a lot of women through our exec summit, and I have a lot of private clients which are women, and all of them are going, I work in a male dominated industry. We're trying to disrupt sort of the quotas, for lack of a better word. What do you think are some of the key things that some of those people that are already in those leadership roles, and I'm talking those men that need to become allies or would benefit from becoming allies, what do they need to unlearn?
Yeah. So it's a difficult one because they are behaving in ways
Yeah.
that gave them successful outcomes before. So,
Mm,
it's rational. It's rational for them to continue to behave in those ways. But I think more executives and more executive teams are really grappling with some problems that require greater collaboration, that require greater interdependencies between the functional roles that executives have. So I think they're being challenged. They're being challenged around vulnerability and more personal leadership. So I think these trends are already here. So there's a case made for that. And we need to make it in some ways beneficial for them to lean into that and to do things differently. And I think that other women can be part of that solution. So
mm,
sometimes we find it uncomfortable to negotiate or even go into a complex, what we feel like might be a complex situation, when we see something happening, when we don't call out the behavior, we
mm,
we don't know how to have that conversation, or we don't know how to perhaps circle back and do it later. I'll give you a really good example. In the book I recently wrote, I asked women to talk about their experiences of power, and one of the contributors, she's beautiful woman. She's in Hong Kong, and she wrote about the fact that she was in a meeting with a male executive, a senior female manager, senior male manager, and she was junior at the time. And what she saw was the executive come in, and he was berating the male manager about a stakeholder that the male manager didn't want to deal with. This guy was avoiding the situation. And so the executive said to him, "Oh, come on, just grow some balls." And the male manager sort of just chuckled or whatever. And then the senior woman said, "Hang on a minute, that's not on. What you've just said
mm,
there, just stop a minute." And the executive kind of didn't know what was, what sort of said, what did I do? What did I do? And he actually walked off because he
yeah.
didn't care. And this is the other thing. It's not my job to change you. It's not my job to change anybody. But you can call out when you notice that something is actually not right. And then the male manager turned to the two women who were left in the room and really in a very authentic way turned around and said, "Why isn't that right? We say that all the time around here. What is
Yeah.
it about that isn't right?" And that was the first time that she'd actually seen someone lean in with curiosity, because we're not going to get it right.
Yeah.
Particularly at the moment, we are so scared to talk about gender and get the pronouns wrong and, be and offend people, that we're just not having conversations. I'm not an expert at all around all of the nomenclature around gender. I don't think anyone is. It's evolving every
Yeah.
moment of the day. How can we be? But what I am is curious, and I'll ask an open question. And so isn't that a beautiful question from him? Because he said, "Why isn't it right?"
Yeah.
With curiosity. And I think so rather than thinking about changing behaviors, it's opening up dialogue, saying,
Yeah.
what are we doing? Like, what if we did it differently? What are we doing that we could change? What are my biases? How does that impact you? Just
Yeah.
open dialogue. And I think that then we start to get an understanding, and we do it with compassion, because I think
Mm,
men and women we're all grappling with the same problems, but I think men in particular are really grappling with this, because we're at a crossroads at the moment where they're getting a lot of information about new ways of in some ways expressing power through these
mm,
new
mm,
gender
mm,
expressions.
mm.
And
Yeah.
unless we have an open dialogue with the men in the room, how do we expect them to gain an understanding, or even to gain that pathway forward for them? It would be a very scary time, I think, without that. So it's
Mm.
compassion. I think we just need to lean in with a bit of compassion.
Oh my gosh, so much to unpack there. And gosh, you literally read my mind when I was thinking, oh, there's going to be some listeners that are going to be questioning whether we're being, the Made for More podcast is being diverse enough around gender
Yeah.
labeling pronouns. And I just want to clarify that we're talking
Mm-mm.
about feminine and masculine energy and how people show up in the world. And I
That's right.
think you're right. It's a continually evolving topic. There's so much fluidity in it, and we are still learning. And I'm not an expert and don't pretend to be an expert by any means
Yeah.
in that space. And there certainly are some great experts to draw on. And I think it's going to be a continual conversation that will evolve even outside of what we're already talking about right now. You said something really interesting there around having some vulnerability, and I think that's it as well. It's very much, and I think leadership in itself is shifting, not necessarily the people so much in it, but leadership in itself is shifting from a do as I say, not what I do, to how can I actually have a conversation, open up some of that dialogue and get curious, and heaven forbid not be the expert and not know all the answers. So I love that there's that story in your book. When you were talking around the statistics of around 17% of women in the C-suite in Australia, do you think, or do you know, have you come across this? Has that gone backwards since, since the pandemic and people did start working from home? I know certainly in my group of colleagues and in my group of friends, there were a number of people that had to either step back, pull back to part-time, or reduce work hours purely on a logistics game. I've read a few articles around what that has meant in terms of equality and what it's meant for women getting a seat at the table. Have you got any qualitative bits you can add to that?
I don't have the most recent statistics, but when you look at the not in Australia, but when you look at the global statistics, really the gaps are not they're not getting any smaller. So so while it didn't go backwards necessarily after COVID, we didn't get this surge forward as well. There's it's glacial movement, and according to the global OECD report, we will have gender parity in terms of positional power and pay gaps as well in 135 years.
Yeah, geez.
And I think we shouldn't wait that long.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, it's interesting when we talk about conditioning. I mean, you talked about conditioning in your own family. You're a daughter of a migrant. I'm the daughter of a woman who was a scientist in her field back in the sort of 70s and 80s.
Wonderful.
When women were not scientists. I also grew up on a farm and, was welding and playing with pumps and doing all sorts of things that little girls shouldn't be doing in my childhood. So my conditioning has been very much around, well, anything you can do, I can do as well. But I know that that's not the same for so many. So I'm always very grateful for that unconditioning early on. Do you think there's is there a bypass? Is there a workaround to break down some of this conditioning? Because often the biases, we're not even aware that we're holding on to them until you go, oh, gee.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get a bit vulnerable. Let's get a bit curious. Is there any kind of circuit breaker that you've come across to just shine a light on those types of beliefs?
Yes. So awareness is really important. And because stereotypes are cognitive functions that really help us. We go through life making categorizations and interpreting and making assumptions because we would have cognitive overload if we didn't do that. We wouldn't be able to think as quickly. But what happens particularly is when we're tired, when we're stressed, that kind of frontal brain that tunes in on reasoning and rationality kind of shuts down. And so particularly when we're under pressure, we're going to those stereotypes are going to come up to the fore even more. And so really what we need to do is slow things down, or have an understanding that when we are under pressure, if we're going to make decisions, we're most likely going to be affected by biases and stereotypes even more so. So that's something to really watch, and that's why slowing things down and that open dialogue and questioning is really important, and particularly having more people involved from different backgrounds in decision making is always going to help as well, because you're diluting some of those assumptions that you make across. But most of the time, we're making decisions as individuals, and it's about definitely slowing that down.
Yeah, I've not heard it from that perspective before. Gosh, you're making my own brain just have a little have a little bit of a backflick. I'm like, oh no, Ali, slow down. Wait, we've got things to do. Because it's the energy, right? It's going, get the stuff done. Actually, no, let's make better decisions. Oh my goodness, I feel like we're going to have a part 2 to this, because I've got further questions, so we'll talk about that afterwards. But Josephine, before we say goodbye, what would be your top 5 tips, either that you wish you knew when you entered the leadership world at your beginning of your career, or some advice that you would have and like to share with leaders now?
Yeah. So the first one is perhaps, well, these aren't in order, but perhaps slow down, like I just said.
Yeah.
I think, I could have benefited from that too. The second one is my feminine unique strengths are valuable for leadership.
Mm.
And I wish I had known that early on, because for many years I tried to fit myself into that round hole and I thought I was a square peg. And then I realized the hole was the wrong shape. I was perfectly round. It was the hole that was square. And I didn't know that. And so I spent many years just, kind of battling that. So really, really believing that your unique feminine strengths are valuable. The other one would be gaining perspectives on biases where I can. So being compassionate, self-compassionate. I will have biases. I will make mistakes, and then starting from there. So having more open curiosity from there. And the next one, I think I'm up to number 4, is
I think this is 4, yes.
for motivate people through autonomy, because they want to do it their way. So, control. You're on a hiding to nothing if you're trying to control your environment and motivate people at the same time. And the last one would be focus on teams, because that's where the collaboration is. I think in organizations, even with leaders, we remunerate, we recognize people individually. Let's what if we actually recognize teams for their collective achievements, and our bonus structures were related solely on that. And I know that that's been trialed and not done well, but we also need to adjust the way in which we see power in that context, because you can't do that and still have hierarchical power, because those things that's why it doesn't work. Those things are at odds. But that would be the thing, focus on teams.
Yes. All right. That's given me some ideas for our next time. Poor Josephine, she's being locked in now because we're recording. No, we will talk about this afterwards. And I mean, I think that's really interesting when you're talking about teams and collaboration, because you touched on it earlier around how do we reward people? Normally it's through achievements, but if that's not your motivator, that's not your intrinsic motivator, then why would you participate in whatever it happens to be if it's not something that's in alignment with you? So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of unfolds over the coming time for teams to go, actually we are better and stronger together than we are as individuals. And I think that's sort of a shift of going, are we safe in the workplace to let some of that vulnerability show and go, yes, I do need my people. They are all important, versus watching your own back, for lack of a better word.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness. And now your book is up on here for everyone who's watching. But for those that are listening, can you just share the title and where people can go to grab a copy?
Yes, it's Rising to Feminine Power, and it's got beautiful Linda Carter Wonder Woman on the front cover. It's an original painting by Melissa Labazetta, and you can find it at www.risingtofemininepower.com.
Brilliant. And I'll add that in the show notes as well if you'd like to grab a copy. And where can people find you, Josephine? Where do you like to hang out?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me, Josephine Palermo with the R, on LinkedIn.
Excellent. I'll add that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Any last words, any last tidbits that you wanted to leave as a takeaway?
Oh, it's been a great conversation. I agree. We could keep talking about this. I'm hoping that this has inspired some people to just start questioning and think differently. So I'd love to hear from you if you have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this episode on the Made for More podcast, please make sure you subscribe to receive future episodes. And of course, 5-star reviews are always welcome on the Apple podcast. If you'd like a copy of the show notes or any of the links mentioned today, check out madeformore.com.au/podcast. And of course, if we aren't connected already, you can find me in all the usual places. Ali Nitschke on LinkedIn, ali.madeformore on Facebook and Instagram. I hope you have an awesome week, and I'll catch you again soon. Bye-bye.